My friends, I greet you this morning in the name of our Savior, Jesus. Have you ever been really afraid? I mean, downright terrified. I mean, so scared that you can actually feel it. You get that pit in your stomach, your heart starts to race, you sweat profusely, and maybe you even begin to think that this was the end. I've had that experience a few times in my life. One was on a plane flight from St. Louis to Evansville, Indiana. Not a very long journey, so we were in a plane that was too high to get above the weather. And as is common in that part of the country, there were thunderstorms. But Midwest thunderstorms aren't just thunderstorms, they are thunderstorms. And this plane, I thought, was going to fall out of the sky. It wasn't very big, which meant that every bump, every movement of the air around us was magnified by what felt like at least a billion. It was a lot. So we would be flying at this altitude, and suddenly, without warning, we were at this altitude down here. The tail of the plane, I kid you not, fishtailed. So we would suddenly be going this way and that way, and in those days, the cockpit was still open, and I could see in, and more terrifyingly hear, the alarms blazing and the lights flashing as my short teenage life flashed before my eyes. And because it was so short, it got to run through a couple of times. I was terrified on that flight. Now, for those of you who are pilots, I'm sure that's no big deal, and that's not anything to really get that worked up over, but for me, it was terrifying. My palms are sweating right now, just thinking about it a little bit this morning. If you know what it's like to be afraid, to have those moments of sheer terror, then you can understand a bit of what's going on in our text for today, because what we see throughout all of this text is a bunch of fear. A bunch of different folks who are, for different reasons, scared and terrified. And when you look at it from this perspective, it opens up some wonderful and important and helpful things for us to know and to believe and to hold on to as we live out our lives as the people of God. So the first group of people that you see in this text that are going to be terrified, downright afraid, is the disciples. Now, all you have to do is go back a few verses from where our gospel lesson for today starts, and the disciples are already terrified. Because in those verses just preceding this text, we find that familiar story of the disciples going across the Sea of Galilee. A storm comes up. Jesus is sleeping in the bow of the boat, and the disciples wake him up, and they say, "Lord, don't you care that we are perishing?" They are terrified. And I figured that has to be a really big deal, because some of them are professional fishermen. So if they are afraid, things must be pretty serious. And so then our text picks up. And what's interesting is the text doesn't tell us if this instance occurs on that same journey or if it was a separate journey. So we don't know if the disciples are already pre-afraid as they arrive on the shore, or if that was something that happened a while ago. But it really doesn't matter. The disciples and Jesus arrive on the other side of the shore of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee in and of itself is not really very big. It's really more of a lake. It's about 11 miles from north to south shore, and it's about 7 miles wide. It's really not that big. But in that small region of land, there was a whole lot going on and a whole lot of activity. And on the other side, the eastern shore, where Jesus and the disciples are now, they are in Gentile territory. This town of the Gerasenes, or this region of the town of the Gerasenes, was part of the Decapolis, those 10 cities that were established and under Roman rule and control. And so Jesus is there in Gentile territory, which would have been a big deal for the disciples, who were good, God-fearing Jewish people. You didn't go into Gentile territory. It was just unheard of. It didn't happen. Not only that, but they are encountered by a man who is possessed with demons, which would have been kind of scary in and of itself. The guy was naked. That would have just been awkward and uncomfortable. And he was living, did you pick up on where he was living? He was living in a graveyard. So here you have a man possessed by demons in Gentile territory, living in a graveyard. This was a place that if you, as an ancient Jew, had to come up with a place that you would never, ever even consider stepping foot into, it would be this scenario right here. And I imagine that the fear that the disciples faced would have been pretty great in that circumstance. So here they are, and Jesus tells the demon to leave the man. And Luke tells us that this man had been plagued by this demon for a while, and that it was really a significant thing. The townspeople didn't know what to do with him. They would try to bind him and to keep him under guard so that he wouldn't hurt them or do any damage. And whenever they did, he would break apart those bonds. The demon would drive him out into the desert, into the wilderness, which coincidentally was considered to be the home and the dwelling place of demons. In the ancient world, the wilderness was where evil dwelt. That's why when Jesus was being tempted, he was led into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And so here, Jesus asked the demon what its name is, and the demon says, Legion, for they are many. Now, one commentator that I read didn't give me a real helpful note on that. It said legion can be anywhere between 4 and 6,000. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6,000. So, somewhere in there, you can average it out and tell me what it is later. But that's what was going on. There were a lot of demons plaguing this guy. And notice how the demons respond to Jesus. Are you here to torment us? They understand the one who is standing before them and who he is. They correctly identify him as the Son of the Most High God. And it's almost ironic, because here the demons correctly understand who is right there in their midst. And yet the disciples and the religious leaders over and over and over again miss the mark. They don't understand that there with them is God in the flesh, Emmanuel. And so the demon asked not to be sent into the abyss, but rather to be sent into a herd of pigs that was somewhere nearby, and Jesus obliges. He allows this to happen. And so the demons go into the pigs, and the pigs rush off of a cliff. They fall into the sea and drown. Now, this is an instance that will give commentators a lot of reason to spill ink in trying to figure this out and understand what it means and all of that. There's a lot of debate that goes on about it, but it's enough to understand that what we see illustrated here is that in the presence of evil, life is destroyed. That's what evil does. So even though the pigs would have been unclean, and this would have been another check in that this is a really scary place category for the disciples, the fact that the demons enter into the pigs and the pigs run into the water means ultimately their destruction, their death, because that's what evil does. That is the effect of the presence of evil in God's creation. it brings about death. It brings about suffering. And what's kind of wonderfully ironic in this whole situation is that the pigs going into the water would have been, from the perspective of the ancient world, the end of the demons as well, because demons can't survive in water. That's why their dwelling place is the wilderness, the desert, where there is very, very little water lying around. And so now we have the townspeople, the swineherders who lost their herd of swine, which is a tragedy in and of itself. They go back to the town. They tell the townspeople and the people in the surrounding region what is going on. They come back to see Jesus, and what do they ask of him? Leave. Go away. Why? Because they are greatly afraid. The original language there says they were fearing a mega fear. That was really big. They were downright terrified. And so they asked Jesus to leave out of that fear. And so Jesus gets in the boat, he gets ready to go, and the man who had been oppressed by the demons, he's now clothed, he's in his right mind. He wants to go with Jesus. But Jesus doesn't allow him to come. Now, the text doesn't give us any reasons why. I suspect, and this is just speculation on my part, but I suspect that it had something to do with the fact that he was a Gentile, and Jesus' ministry in the Galilee and especially in Judea would have been significantly hindered with a Gentile following them around. But I can't prove that. I'm just guessing that. But Jesus doesn't allow the man to come with him, but instead, what does he do? Did you notice? At the very end, he sends the man back to his home. He sends the man back to his hometown. But he doesn't just say, go away. He doesn't just send him to get rid of him. He sends him with a purpose. Did you notice what that purpose was? The purpose was for the man to tell the story of what God had done for him. He is being sent to be a missionary, to be a witness to the presence and action and activity of God in his life. He is sent to tell the good news of what Jesus has done for him. So no more is fear in charge. Fear is replaced. And now there is mission and this opportunity to go and to share and to proclaim the good news of what God has done for this man in Jesus. And so there's some interesting things, some tidbits that we can pull out of this text and consider for our own lives. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive treatment of this. You would be exhausted afterwards if you had to sit and listen to the whole thing. But we're going to just talk about a few of them. And the first is that in those scary places that we might find ourselves in life, Jesus is not afraid to go there. You know, we live our lives in such a way as that there are sometimes places that are off limits, that we will not go. And those can be literal places, but they could also be proverbial places. And we don't like to venture into that territory. It can be scary. But I think it is wonderfully comforting to know and important to understand that when it comes to our God and to his mission in this world, when it comes to the power of the gospel being proclaimed to the people of this world, no place is off limits from the presence of God. His presence is not something that is just to be reserved for the walls of sacred space, but it is something that goes out to the entire world, even into the places that we wouldn't want to dare tread ourselves. And what happens when the presence of evil in those scary places finds themselves face to face with Jesus, finds themselves toe to toe with him? What happens when that situation occurs? The evil is driven out. It does not stand a chance. It is not more powerful than he is. So those places that we might be afraid to go, those territories that would be scary to tread into, we no longer have to see as scary places because we know that our God can go there as well. And actually, knowing our God and his character, the chances are pretty high that he's already there and working and preparing the way for us to show up and join him in the work that he is doing. So when it comes to our God, there are no places that are off limits. That's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that Jesus is more powerful than anything that we will ever encounter. No force of evil is greater than him. No thing that would bring fear into our lives, no matter how much it might make our palms sweat and our stomachs tie up in knots, nothing in this life that we will ever face is too hard or difficult for Jesus. Nothing. Not the powers and forces of evil, not the power of sin, not even death is too powerful for Jesus. Now, if we were left to our own devices, if we were left to our own power, then of course we wouldn't stand a chance. Sin and death and the devil would be too much for us to try to overcome. And we could work our entire lives and we still wouldn't do it. We could work several lifetimes if that were possible, and it still wouldn't be enough. But what is impossible for us is not impossible for our God. And Jesus is victorious over sin and death and the powers of evil and the devil. He has defeated sin and death and the devil on the cross. He rose victoriously from the grave. And because he lives, then all of us who belong to him, all of God's people, all of us who have been adopted into God's family have that victory as well over sin and death and the devil. Your sins are forgiven. Everlasting life is yours. And you have this because God works this in your life in his grace, out of his love for you. And as you know, you might have heard this once or twice around here, whenever God does something, he always does it right. Right? Right. Yeah, that's not a trick question. The answer is always right when we get to that. And knowing that God does things right gives us confidence. It gives us assurance. It gives us sure and certain knowledge. It gives us hope in knowing that this is ours as well. And then the third thing I want you to take from this text is this sending that takes place of the man who was healed from the demonic possession. Jesus sends the man to go back to his home, to his family, to his friends, to his neighbors, and to tell them what? Did you pick up on it? He's to tell them the story of what God has done for him. He's to tell them the story of the ways that God has worked in his life. You know, I think sometimes we get this idea in our heads that says, unless you've gone to seminary, unless you know how to use a lot of really big theological words or read Greek or Hebrew, that allows you to come up with great translations like mega fear, by the way. Unless you have done that and experienced that, then you're not qualified to go and talk about faith with others and to tell them about Jesus. And somehow, I don't know where it comes from, but we get this idea that we are untrained and unqualified to do so. But notice the way that Jesus sent this man. He didn't say, I want you to go to seminary, and I want you to study for several years, and I want you to learn the original languages, and I want you to do all of this stuff. And please don't misunderstand me. Those things are important. They are good. They have a place. But I just want you to see and understand that in this instance, all Jesus is sending the man to do is tell the story of what God has done in his life. And that's a story that each and every single one of us knows well. We know what God has done for us. We know how Jesus has worked in our life. And so as God sends us, because that's exactly what he does for us, as God sends us out into our neighborhoods, our communities, our homes, our places of work, our schools, as God sends us out into the places that he sends us, he doesn't send us to have to make complicated theological treatises and have arguments and debates and all of that stuff. He sends us to simply tell the story of the way that God has worked in your life. And it could be simple as, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. How awesome is that? You see, God doesn't need us to join him in his work, but he delights in inviting us and bringing us along. And we benefit as we see God working through us in the lives of others, as they hear the good news of God's love for the world in Jesus and the forgiveness and life and salvation that come only through him. And as they experience that in their own lives, we get to have the joy of being a part of it. And it is a really wonderful thing. You are sent. You are sent by God. It is no mistake that you are here right now, today in this place, hearing the things that I am saying. And you're not just sent as an individual, but we are sent together as a body of believers, as a community of faith, to go out and to tell what Jesus has done for us. To remind one another of God's love for us, of the forgiveness and life and salvation that are ours in Jesus, to walk together, to share life together, and to engage in mission together. Because you are sent. So delight in that. Find joy in that. And look for those opportunities that God gives to you to tell that powerful story of God's love and working in your life. And as we live our lives in this way, may God be glorified and may we be blessed now and always. Amen.